Welcome to another episode of Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. I'm Ian Glacken, Executive Consultant at Snowden Optiro here in Perth. And today I'm chatting with Rayleen Hargreaves. Rayleen is the Product Owner for Reconcilor and also a Principal Consultant with Datamine. Good morning, Rayleen.
Good morning, Ian. Good to be here.
Thank you. So what are we talking about today? We had quite a notable event about 9 days ago on the 1st of August. And this was the release of the draft version of the 2025 JORC Code. Now, I say 2025, it's 2024, but by the time it's been edited and revised, it'll probably be 2025, and there'll be a 1-year transition. So this is just a few words on this, quite interesting. Well, if you're interested in this sort of thing. It's been going on for quite a while. I think the JORC committee originally started the process way back in 2021, and there was lots of discussions with the stakeholders being the AusIMM, the AIG, the Minerals Council of Australia, and probably most importantly ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, the regulator, the government, and also the ASX, the Australian Securities Exchange. And I understand there was a lot of discussions around the revision and lots of things. So the other thing I just want to mention is, in terms of full disclosure, is that the JORC committee or the process, they hired a number of working groups, and these working groups were formed from industry people to comment on various aspects of the code. Now, this morning, we're going to talk about just one aspect of the revised code, and this is reconciliation. And I should say that, as I said to you, myself and Craig Morley, who's also one of my colleagues at Snowden Optiro, were on the reconciliation working group. There was about 8 or 9 people. So again, a few words on the actual documents itself. There's now, the JORC code used to be one 80 or 90 page document. Now, essentially, we've got 3 documents. The first one is the code itself, which is about 50 pages. The second one is the guidelines, which is sort of explaining and clarifying and providing supporting information for the code, and that's about 50 pages. Then we've also got this revised table 1, which is, if you like, the checklist. So it's changed quite a lot, and it's a lot bigger, and because it's been so long, it's in the last code was released in 2012, so it's been a long time. There's quite a few changes. And another thing that's been going on without sort of not really impacting on this discussion here is this idea of the Competent Persons Task Force. So the Competent Persons Task Force was a discussion among the stakeholders. So again, the AusIMM, the AIG, the ASIC, ASX, about what a competent person should be. Now, we're not going to talk about that because that's a whole can of worms, let's say, different topic. So today we're going to talk about reconciliation, because that's what Rayleen and I are expert in. So what I thought I might do just as a start is just read you the actual first 2 paragraphs of section 10 of the revised JORC code, paragraph 10. So I'm just going to read this. It's quite boring, but I think it'll set the notes for the discussion. So the JORC code says chapter 10, reconciliation. The term reconciliation refers to the comparison of an estimate to a prior estimate, such as a mineral resource or ore reserve, or the comparison of the extracted part of the estimate to mine production results. One more paragraph. The prior estimate comparison between the revised mineral resource and ore reserve with its predecessor is required to address certain clauses in the code. The production reconciliation involves a comparison of estimates and production outcomes. Both prior estimate and production reconciliations must be disclosed by the competent person in Table 1 and discussed in the public report. So, Rayleen, what are your thoughts on the definitions of reconciliation and comparison to what's come before?
I think they've got it spot on with the definition of reconciliation. It is the comparison, for me, the comparison across the mine value chain, any nodes. And so I'm talking about looking at the resource model to the production. I'm talking about the reserve model to production and so forth. So absolutely spot on with that. I think it probably just needs to be a little bit of tightening up with the nomenclature that they've used. So, I'll just borrow your notes here. If we look at the first paragraph, it talks about mine production. I think I had a conversation with you yesterday. Are they talking about what's coming out of the ground? Are they talking about what's coming out of the plant? Just defining what that mine production value should be. And then that second paragraph we look at, it talks about production reconciliation. So again, not specifically telling you which production results thereafter. Is it coming out of the ground, the mining? Is it maybe a grade control model or an ore control model results? Or is it, a survey and so forth? So yeah, but otherwise, generally happy, just a little bit more clarification, I guess.
Yeah. So what I would say, and maybe I didn't make this quite clear when we started, is that there's a consultation process. So all the various documents were issued on the 1st of August, and we being the public have until the end of October to comment. So and then after that, between October and January next year, let's say, there'll be some revision of the code. So just to sort of effectively summarise the way I see it, we're now talking about two different types of reconciliation. The first one, which I would call, it's a historical reconciliation against the past and previous models, whether it's resource or reserve. Mm-hmm. That's essentially been in the code in the last version of the code, and indeed in the other codes. The other codes, the key codes being, say, the CIM guidelines, 2014, the SAMREC code, 2020, I think it is, or 2016. Sorry, I apologise if I don't know. And then the PERC code, which is 2021. They all talk about reconciliation or comparison of this estimate with the previous estimate. And of course, the whole reason that we have the JORC code or all these other codes is all about the reporting and the classification of resources and reserves. So it's very important to compare this model with the previous model, and that's there at the moment. So what's new this time, as Rayleen's just been saying, is this idea that we're going to compare the depletion or the change in the resource or the reserve with some measure of production. Now, whether it's production from the mine, I would see it personally, and as I said to you, I was on a working group that talked about this. I would really think about it as being the production from the processing plant. In other words, the actual tons and grade that come out. And the intention, the way I see it, is that you have a change in the resource, a change in the reserve through depletion, and there might be other reasons for a change, and that's another issue, complicating things. And then you need to compare that with production from the either from the mine or from the processing plant. So just to comment, as I said to you, that's not in any of the other codes at the moment. There is a document which is definitely worth looking at, and this is the CIM Best Practice Guidelines, and this was issued, I think, 2014, and this is like an 80-page document talking about best practice, and this sort of goes into reconciliation in some detail, but I would see that as really guidelines for best practice. What we have now is the JORC code, the sort of semi-legal document, if you like. Then we have the guidelines. So what I'd just like to do again is read out from the guidelines. So this is the second document that comes with the JORC code, and there's just a couple of paragraphs on reconciliation, and I'll ask Rayleen to comment in a second. Okay, so in reconciliation, this is the guidelines. It says, where material changes in resources and reserves are the result of depletion by mine production, the competent person, remember that there's always a competent person putting his or her name to this, must conduct and report a reconciliation that compares both mineral resource and ore reserve estimates to achieve production results. That's the issue, according to the criteria set out in section 10, which is what I've just read. One more paragraph. Ore reserve estimates should be reported after depletion and reconciliation with production data in line with section 11 of the code. Section 11 of the code talks about scoping studies, pre-feasibility studies and feasibility studies. Such adjustments for depletion and the reconciliation methods should be clearly described in a public report of ore reserves. So Rayleen, how do you interpret those two paragraphs?
So, where the material changes in mineral resources and ore reserves are the result of a depletion by mine production. Again, it's that mine production. What are we talking about?
Yeah,
I think that's just the biggest question mark for me. But the changes between the resource and the reserve have always, we've always had to report the materiality changes between those. So that's fine. The fact that you're actually going to have to declare what you've depleted from that model, it's always been a tough one to actually get that information. Some companies report that, but most, and I will say most, do not. And it's really hard to work out from the year-on-year changes between models what has actually been depleted, because obviously we do drilling and we add to resources and reserves on a regular, at least on an annual basis.
And the commodity price changes.
Absolutely, there's so many changes. It's not just about what's being depleted. So to actually have the ability to now provide that depleted portion of the model so that you can compare it against, let's say, the plant production. The reason you've been you've had investment in the company is because you've said this is what we've got in the ground. How well you're actually mining that is important to the investor. They want to know that you're actually doing the job properly.
Sure. Yeah, I think this principle it's spot on. And when I talk about resource and indeed reserve validation, there's various ways of validating your resource, comparing against the data. But I always finish off my discussion on that by saying that, the real acid test for a resource and indeed a reserve is how well it compares against production. So perhaps you could comment on this issue that we're being asked to reconcile or report the resource depletion and the reserve depletion against production. You wouldn't expect those two to be the same, would you?
Absolutely not. We know that there's a difference between a resource and a reserve. That is why we have two different models. We've got a lot of modifying factors between the two. No, I wouldn't expect them to be the same. And in fact, they shouldn't be the same. If they are, then there's a problem.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think, I think of it as in two different aspects as well. We've got open pits, which is a lot easier to deplete those models. But then we're talking about underground as well, and there is no differentiation between the two in the code, in the guidelines anyway. So it's just making sure that everybody's actually going about depleting those underground models in the same way that it's going to be comparable and against that mine production or that plant production.
Yeah, no, that is an issue. Another phrase that I would just question the meaning thereof is where material changes in resources and reserves are the result of depletion by mine production. Well, that's a bit funny, because mine production is something that goes on every year, every day, every month. And, what is a material change? I mean, if you're just producing as per the budget, however many tons per annum or whatever, is that a material change? And the other side of that is, if you don't consider it to be a material change, then does that mean that you don't have to report any reconciliation? So I think that's a little bit ambiguous.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I would also question, what is the material change once you're mining? Yeah.
Now, obviously, you can have material changes in resources and reserves, as you said, due to commodity price, due to reinterpretation, whatever. And does that mean that you have to then report the reconciliation? And if your mine is just producing normally as per the budget, does that mean you don't have to report reconciliation? So I think there's a little bit of ambiguity here, and perhaps in the editing phase of the JORC code, that's something that we can that can be revised. Another thing I just wanted to mention as well is this idea of factoring a reserve by the reconciliation results. Have you come across that?
I've not come across that, and it just makes me shudder, to be honest. Okay,
well, what I would say is I've seen it. I haven't seen it very often. I have to say mostly it's South Africa, and it's very common practice on the Wits, where, in other words, you would take the reconciliation between the reserve and production, however you define production, from the plant, and if it was like a 98% mine call factor, then you would factor your reserves by 2%. As I agree with you that's very dangerous practice, and if I was advising someone, I would never advise them to do that. But anyway, that is part of this code. This revision is that you need to report on these factors that are being used. Now, some companies do that, but a lot of companies don't. I don't find it too common. anywhere apart from South Africa.
I was going to say, was that at underground mines? Is it where there's uncertainty?
It's mostly underground mines, yeah. It's going to happen less often in an open pit. But I have seen it happen in open pits as well. So, I think we're sort of getting off track a little bit here, but I think the whole point of doing that, or one of the issues of doing that, is that you're chasing a moving target. You're correcting it, and then something else might go wrong. You're correcting it again, rather than trying to fix it through remodeling or the way you report or stockpiles or whatever. So let's assume that this version of the code, this two types of reconciliation. So let's call that resource reserve reconciliation and production or reconciliation. What changes do you see in public reporting? What do you think that's going to affect what companies are actually reporting in their public documents?
Well, it will have to, because I really don't see that they're reporting the depleted models now. So
no one is. I don't think I've ever seen it.
No. Yeah. So it's going to have an impact. The majority of companies that I deal with are actually doing the depletion. It's just they're not reporting it. So I think it's going to make a big difference. Having an auditable process, transparency around the way that they're actually generating those numbers and depleting that will be very important as well. And just having some ownership. So, approving that data before we actually report is also going to be extremely important.
Yeah, I would say, like you, that any company that is producing from a mine should be doing reconciliation of that nature. And if they're not, then
they need
something
to get on
seriously
board.
wrong.
They need to get on board and start doing it. Look, this is baby steps, for
I think so. Yeah.
It will only get more prescriptive as revisions come out.
And what would you say about standards in this area? Obviously, when it comes to resources, we have measured, indicated, inferred, proven, and probable. But what standards do we have in reconciliation?
I'm sure most people listening have heard me talk about the F series and the R series reporting. So it's just looking at those big key nodes on that mine value chain. So the resource model and comparing that against mining and comparing it against the plant, what's being produced at the plant, as well as the reserve model as well. So I'm all about, if you've got the data, compare it, see how well it's actually going across that mine value chain. One thing I have noticed that there's no way, we're talking about just giving a number, I think, rather than actually giving a percentage change or a ratio or a factor against those comparisons. But by giving the number, anybody can actually generate those values.
Right.
So I think it's important that we actually provide the number rather than just the ratio or just the percentage change, because it means that the mum and dad investor out there can actually work out what's going on. I guess down the track, there's an opportunity then to actually standardise how we do that and how we actually do that comparison, rather than just providing the absolute number.
I would expect and hope to see both the actual numbers themselves and some sort of percentage change or factor. Yeah. And I guess another issue is the terminology. You and I both work a lot in this field, and we see 10, 20 different types of terminology. And I think there's an issue there where the investors may get confused by all these different terminology.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the point where I've actually started in the last 12 months, I think I've started moving away from referring to those comparisons as F factors and R factors, and actually saying, call it for what it is. Is it the resource model to the plant production? Call it that. Use some abbreviations, but don't necessarily give it a name like an F, an F3 or an F2, whatever it might be. And that is just to avoid any confusion. Anybody can actually look at the numbers and actually understand what they're reading, rather than going, I don't know what F1 is. We've got one mine site that it calls it F1 and the next one calls it G1, So it's just being able to, understand what you're analysing easily.
Yeah. No, I think in particular the headline reconciliation is the F2, as you and I would agree, but I've seen different definitions of F2. And some people just say F2. Now, F2 can be this, it can be that. And I see a potential trap here is that people say, our F2 reconciliation is 105%. And as you say, the shareholders, the investors are saying, well, what the hell do they mean? You and I can't, not you and I, but companies can't agree on what actually is the F2, even though it's sort of clearly defined in the original work by Parker. But, there's various interpretations of that. So I see that as a potential minefield, pardon the pun. I think I think there's lots of things that need to be clarified. So do you think this is going to actually push us towards some sort of reconciliation standard?
I would hope so, but again, I don't know necessarily that it needs to have a name against it. I think as long as we're being prescriptive in the fact that we say we want to be able to look at the numbers between the resource model and the production, and the reserve model between the production, you're getting those big key comparisons there. Yeah. I don't necessarily need to know that they've been given a name, but if I can actually pull out data from every mine site around the world and know that I've got the depletion for the resource and I've got the production data, then I can create those comparisons myself, or I know what those comparisons are because they're available without knowing what they're called. But I do think there needs to be a little bit more prescription in the fact that this is where we're aiming for. This is what we're trying to achieve, maybe it is that F1, F2, F3, and then being able to to get that data out easily, because that's what we can't do. We can't get the data out. We cannot benchmark mine A against mine B easily. And if I'm investing in a company, I want to know how well one company is performing over another. And by having they're being mandated, I guess, to actually be able to provide that data, or being told to provide that data, it gives somebody else the opportunity to actually do that review and analysis and make decisions on those results.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I mean, we've done many audits, we still do, but and I've seen situations, not naming any companies, where the reserve depletion was only 50%, or rather it was 50% higher than actually what the production came out of the plant. So, I think one issue I see is that if companies are going to report that, then they're going to have some explaining to do. And as you say, transparency is part of the issue. So I think there's a lot of issues here that need to be discussed. I mean, the way I see it, you've got a resource, you're mining part of it, not all of it. You've got a reserve, you're mining part of that. How does that depletion of the reserve and the resource compare against, and the way I see it is what's come out of the plant. In other words, what's either gone to the plant, what's gone to tails, or what's in the stockpiles. I mean, that to me is the classic reconciliation. Because after all, we're not really here to, in the JORC Code anyway, to talk about production. We're here to say, well, here's a reserve I'm declaring, here's a resource I'm declaring. Last year we depleted it by X, and our production reconciliation was X plus or minus 2%. And I see that as sort of what we're trying to achieve. I think one of the issues is what people mean, different terminology and different standards or different interpretations of that.
Yeah, I guess I ask about the question: is it the mine production? Is it the actual plant production? We should be comparing all along the mine value chain, only because by the time you get to the plant product, there's a lot of places everything could have fallen down. And if you're not actually measuring along that mine value chain and taking into account your blasting and your stockpiling and what you're feeding to the crusher, then without understanding that, you're going to struggle to explain the difference as to why you've actually not meeting those targets, I guess.
And I can see some companies interpreting this as saying, well, this is what my reserve depletion said, this is what my grade control model said, here's my reconciliation. In other words, not involving the process plant or the product at all.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's a little bit of ambiguity that's crept into this code that needs to be tightened up, because I can't see any decent reconciliation that doesn't look at the product or the actual. I mean, I've seen people compare, reserve against grade control, and I think, that's fine. But what does the plant say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that's an issue. So so I would say, and I agree with you, that this is a great start, baby steps, and it's the first time that this sort of production reconciliation terminology has made it into any of these codes. And the other thing I would say is that these codes, as you know, they tend to leapfrog each other. So, the most recent code then becomes the template for the next code. And if this JORC code comes out 2025, let's say, then this will become the template for the CIM code, which is being updated at the moment, and then perhaps the SAMREC code in South Africa, and so on. So I guess what I'm saying is that this discussion on reconciliation will propagate certainly into the other codes, and eventually it'll become a worldwide thing in the CRISCO framework. So I guess all kudos to the JORC committee and the advisors for putting it in there. And I was part of that discussion. But I think, we have to get it right, because this is going to set the template for other codes to follow.
Yeah, I agree. Look, it was sort of like a career goal for me to see this in the code. So I'm really happy. Does that mean I can retire now? I'm not sure.
I hope so.
But maybe the next release of JORC. But
I think I'll be retired then.
Yeah,
and
that's right. I'll take over.
If it's anything like the time difference with this one, it's going to be a long time.
I know it might be. But look, I'm really pleased that they've taken the step and at least got it into the draft, and I'm really interested to see what the feedback is.
We'll obviously have a chance to put that feedback in. And I think it's important that people comment on this podcast on our views, but also generally on this, because I think this is it's a major area. It's, as you say, it's something that you and I have both been looking forward to seeing in a sort of semi-official way for a long time. There are lots of other areas of the JORC code update, not least of which is this idea of the competent persons, but that's the topic for another podcast or three. So for now, thank you very much, Rayleen.
Thank you, Ian. It's been a pleasure.
Discussion. So if you'd like to hear more of our Fresh Thinking podcasts, please subscribe. Please look at them on YouTube, Google, or wherever you find all good podcasts. Thank you very much.